Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. Today's webinar is It's All About Roots and Proper Tree Planting with Dr. Ryan Klein. He will cover site evaluation and tree selection for successful urban landscapes. And what I'd like, if you feel so inclined, go ahead and put in the chat box your favorite urban tree or maybe what county you're from. We'd love to hear from you. Also would like to let you know that this webinar is approved for 1 ISA, 1 FNGLA, Florida Water Star, LIAF, DBPR Landscape Architecture, and FDEX CEU. There is a $10 administration fee to receive a certificate for continuing education, and I'll put that link in the chat box a little later in the webinar today. And I just want to let you know that we give everybody a day or two to have a chance to sign up for those CEUs. So you probably won't get your CEU certificate until Friday. We will go ahead and submit those CEUs to the licensing agency, and then we'll send you that certificate. So this is part of a monthly webinar series held on the second Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. Our next webinar is November 8th, which is mangroves coming to a neighborhood near you with Alyssa Benson. And just so you know, your microphones have been muted. Please go ahead, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll take them at the end of the presentation. Also, you might have seen a survey invitation pop up. Please take a moment to fill this out because it really helps us determine what educational programs that we will offer in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm Tom Wickman. I'm the Assistant Director for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program and the statewide coordinator for the Green Industries Best Management Practices Program. And so thank you so much for being with us and joining us today. It's my pleasure to get to introduce our speaker. Dr. Ryan Klein is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Horticulture at the University of Florida. His research focuses on the risks associated with urban trees and their survival following hurricanes and other intense storms. Ryan's interests center around exploring the impacts that urban forests have on the health and safety of our urban populations. He views the relationship between people and their natural surroundings as being especially significant since most of the world's population live in urban areas and urban sprawl continues to consume our remaining natural spaces. Human interactions such as planning and management become ever more important to the sustainability of our urban forests. Dr. Klein has a dynamic and varied research program. He offers an arboriculture class and helps to get his findings out to the industry and the public with an active extension program. Today, Ryan's going to help you get the best start with your trees with his presentation, It's All About the Roots. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Essentially, it's exactly that. We're going to be talking about anything and everything related to roots today, from, prior to planting all the way to the establishment period. We're going to look at, the urban landscape in general, a little bit on site evaluation, and then proper placement and some design options related to getting off to a successful start where your tree is going to perform well in the landscape. We're going to look at how roots actually grow in a couple different nursery scenarios, whether it be from seed or some different container options. And then selecting nursery stock that's going to be well suited for your site conditions. And then we're going to touch a little bit on proper planting procedures. Not too much on that, but just enough to make you a little bit dangerous as far as being able to plant a tree correctly. So I'm sure we're all used to seeing, trees in these urban environments, which can lead to some maybe adverse effects due to these harsh conditions that we commonly see in these areas. Things like poor soil quality. You're going to see those small planting spaces. This can result to drought-like conditions. Trees are susceptible to construction damage, and they may or may not be maintained. All this leads to potentially high mortality in these areas. So these urban trees are going to have a shorter life expectancy than you'd typically see in a forest setting. And some trees will do well in these areas, but unfortunately, we see a lot of trees that do well in these areas get overplanted. which can lead to adverse things down the road. If we have a pest or disease issue come in, we have this monoculture, and then we can lose large portions of our canopy as a result. And then less commonly used species can be difficult to find sometimes at nurseries, especially if you need large quantities, for maybe a municipal planting program, it can be difficult. So past research has suggested this idea of planting, the right tree in the right place, both as a means of saving time and money, in relation to your planting program. But essentially, you need to determine what's going to grow well in your local area. Local knowledge goes a long way. There's plenty of online resources, but essentially, you're going to be evaluating the site and making sure that whatever you plant there is, going to be able to perform well into the future. And then also you want to, incorporate some things related to desired species traits, and then specifically, like I said, ability to survive at that site. So it's about maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risk to public health and safety. And ultimately, when you have low survival rates, it's going to be a loss of those long-term benefits. So, those successful planting programs, whether it be, municipal wide or even, for homeowners and general public, it all starts with that high quality nursery stock, free of any major defects that could fail in the future. So when you're doing a site evaluation, there's different characteristics that you're going to identify that might affect the growth and the establishment, the long-term success of that tree. So some of the above ground things you want to consider, you have environmental factors such as access to sunlight, how much wind is in an area. That's especially important down here in Florida with, hurricanes periodically hitting the state, saltwater intrusion, neighboring trees. Then you have urban factors, maybe you have overhead utility lines where you're wanting to plant. So that might kind of determine what species you put there. Proximity to building and signs and stuff like that, may make it difficult to plant a tree in that area. And then you have below ground attributes that you're going to want to consider, things related to the soil, whether it be pH or compaction, maybe drainage issues. And then, are there any potential site modifications that can be made to make it, a more habitable place for a tree to be planted? In some situations, you can move utility lines and wires depending on the site. Soil amendments might be practical, although typically if the tree doesn't grow at the site in the native soil, you're probably planting the wrong species. You can improve drainage, and then, things on the back end, such as, maintenance, making sure the tree's irrigated, some sort of regular pruning regime, potentially fertilization, pest control, stuff like that. So unfortunately, we see this too often, these small planting spaces. The tree's ultimately going to become stressed. It's going to stunt the tree's growth. Survival rate's going to be lower in these instances. And these lead to potential future hazards, and we're wasting time, money, and, loss of those benefits. So we need to plan and design, situations that are going to be more conducive to the success of that tree in the landscape. So we need to look at alternative design options in comparison to what we're seeing here. So obviously those small islands are probably the worst case scenario. Peninsulas are going to be a better option there, where you have one end of that island kind of opened up to where the roots can grow out. That'd be in the center. Or, these planting strips, so then the roots can grow, down a longer space rather than being confined all the way around. But essentially, the less the roots are surrounded by curbing, the better growth you're going to have, and the longer that tree is going to survive in the landscape. So, these common planting issues that we're seeing here, it all comes down to adequate space for the roots. But essentially, a lot of times in these urban areas, we have poor designs that don't account for future growth. So if you look at the tree here to the left, you got a 4-inch diameter live oak that, appears to fit in that space. It's about a 4-foot space. But what we're not considering is that, when you get to maturity, if you look at the image on the right there, over time, that tree is going to outgrow that space, and it's going to start to affect its functionality and its overall performance in the landscape. So mature trees, we need to keep in mind, have a zone of rapid taper. And this is essentially where the enlarged buttress roots quickly transition to ropey laterals. And a study by Hauer et al. Found that this extends approximately 4 feet past the visible root flare. And we'll see what this looks like here in a bit as far as, determining size of planting space. But essentially, this open soil space is what allows for that root flare to develop. And if you're putting them in too much small confined area, it's not going to happen adequately. And it's the root flare that provides balance and stability to these, massive sized trees at maturity and supports that weight. So the research has found that that trunk flare diameter increases proportionally with DBH. So you can see that on the left there, that figure. So the DBH gets bigger, so does the trunk flare. And the planting space recommendations that have been developed recently try to avoid any sort of conflicts with infrastructure. So your curbing, your sidewalks, stuff like that. So what they found is that planting spaces need to accommodate both that trunk flare diameter and then about 4 feet on each side of the tree. So you can see that there on the right. So based off of some street tree data in Tampa, Kozer calculated that for a live oak, you need about 16 feet minimum planting width for a tree that can get up to 69 inches in diameter. For a laurel oak that can get to 54 inches in diameter, you need about 14 feet minimum planting space. And then for a smaller species like a crepe myrtle, let's say, about 8 inches in diameter, you need about 3 feet. Unfortunately, we don't see any of those scenarios play out in practice to where we're allowing that much of a planting space in our urban areas, unless it's like a park situation. But when you're talking street trees, you're never seeing 16 feet for a live oak, and you rarely even see 3 feet for a crepe myrtle, unfortunately. So it's going to affect how these trees perform, down the road. So when you don't allow enough space, you get roots that are deflected. They're not able to grow underneath the pavement, and it's going to, basically limit the tree's ability to put on growth, stress the tree out. It's essentially like the tree's planted in a large container, like you would see at a nursery. And in these situations, you notice on the right-hand side, these are the trees you're going to see fail in extreme wind events. I don't know if you watched much of the news from Hurricane Ian. Essentially, the whole tree failures that you saw, the vast majority of them were due to small planting spaces. And then the other situations where you lost large limbs and stuff like that were typically due to bark inclusions or some other sort of defect that was more likely to fail. But in situations like this, where you've already planted in a small space, there's not a lot you can do. It's essentially the wrong tree in the wrong place. So the big takeaways here are, the roots are key to the tree's success in the urban landscape. So if you start off with either poor quality roots, or, a space that's not adequate enough for that root system, the tree's going to struggle. Ultimately, it'll die prematurely. So, those high quality roots are going to promote healthy, well-performing trees in the landscape. So spaces can be designed prior to planting to fit the desired tree, at a given site. So when you don't have adequate soil space, you can use things like structural soils, suspended sidewalks, different types of surface materials, soil cells, stuff like that. Fortunately, some of these are not being done in practice, either due to a lack of understanding on how to install them or the price point. Some of these things can be expensive. So there's some barriers there, but all these options are going to allow for root growth and, support some of those surface materials. So, we got to be creative with our design solutions here as far as, plantings go, and it's going to increase the lifespan of our urban trees and, reduce some of those conflicts related to infrastructure and, damage that results from it. So, with careful planning and design that can incorporate that idea of a right tree in the right place, or, worst case scenario, designing a space that's going to fit the tree, it's going to lead to more successful urban plantings, support tree health up to a mature age, which again, we don't see very often. A lot of times, these trees are short-lived. And it's about adapting to these harsh urban conditions or, planning on the front end to accommodate for them. So the big takeaway here is, the more space you have for the roots to grow, more anchorage, which again is important in Florida given the hurricane situation. And, they're better able to withstand some of these extreme weather events. All right, so now we're going to kind of step back a little bit and look at roots, from the infancy of the plant all the way up to prior to putting them in the landscape. Now that we know some of the situations that these trees and the roots face once they're planted, depending on design and stuff like that. So we're going to look at things like form, how this can impact anchorage, different types of containers that trees are grown in and some of the issues related to them. And then some ways we can improve root form prior to planting the tree in a landscape. So to kind of, just give an overview of roots here, they serve 4 primary functions. So the first 3 functions, anchorage, storage, and conduction, these all have to do with your large structural woody roots. Those are the ones that are found near the surface. And then the last function, absorption, this has more to do with the small fibrous fine roots. And those are typically found in the top 12 inches of the soil or so. And then roots grow in areas where there's available moisture and oxygen. So you have some different types of roots here. You have your oblique roots. They're going to be kind of similar to your ropey lateral roots. And they kind of grow diagonally down. And then trees also have things like sinker roots, which grow down off the laterals. Sometimes you'll see tap roots on certain species of younger trees, but ultimately over time, they're going to get choked out by the other roots and, growing conditions, access to oxygen and water, stuff like that. And then overall, you have your root crown, and this is the area where the roots meet the trunk. So you know it either as maybe the root flare or the trunk flare. So roots can spread 2 to 3 times wider than the crown of a decurrent tree. And the roots can be, the fine roots can be found well beyond the canopy of the tree at maturity. So these roots are going to help anchor the tree under those high wind events. And in urban areas, these roots are often confined to small spaces like we saw earlier. So I'm not going to talk much about palms. I'm by no means a palm expert, but I just wanted to kind of throw this in there just to kind of, give you a quick idea of palms in relation to what we're going to continue to talk about for the rest of the talk. But essentially, at the base of the palm, this is the root initiation zone, and it's typically close to the surface of the soil. So different from dicots, the roots of palms are consistently put out, and you have these small diameter roots that don't branch out much like you would see, with like an oak tree or a maple or something like that. Typically, these roots are going to be straight, and it'll help the palm to withstand hurricanes and strong wind events. Typically, in a hurricane, you might see all the fronds blown off, but the trunk of the palm will still be standing. So they're pretty well rooted in for these events, and it's going to help support that tree. So now we're going to specifically start looking at, dicots. Here's some oak seedlings. So you see a taproot coming out. There's no deflection on the ones on the left. They're basically going straight down. And then as you're moving towards the right, you're starting to see an increasing amount of deflection. And this can happen, from anything as small as like a leaf on the ground, maybe a rock, a branch, something like that was buried. But essentially 1 in about 1 billion seeds is actually going to make it to maturity when you're looking at a forested setting. So those on the left, those are the ones that are going to have the best chance because they're starting off with, the best root system of the ones on the screen. So as the tree's aging, that root system is going to develop. And in this case, divided into 2. You might see some bends, some twists. But basically, there's less oxygen the deeper you go in the soil, and it's going to suppress the taproot over time. That's why you don't really see taproots on a lot of mature trees. And then while that's happening, it starts to initiate surface roots. So the tree continues to get older, somewhere in, let's say, that 3 to 4 year range. In this case, the taproot's still present, but then you start seeing oblique roots develop, and those are the ones that are going to go at an angle and follow below the trunk. Typically, they don't go out too far. And then only the surface roots are going to extend out far beyond, and branch and become larger. and help stabilize the tree as it becomes older and larger. So deep roots are possible, but primarily it's surface roots. So you're going to have this root flare that's going to develop, and then the horizontal roots are going to extend out in that zone of rapid taper that we talked about earlier. And then the sinker roots are going to grow down off the surface roots. So when you look at it from 3D architecture of the root system, it makes it strong and stable and able to support itself. That's why, you know, with those small planting spaces, trees losing a lot of its ability to support itself. So then the roots, they're going to produce more wood on the top than on the bottom. And this growth pattern is following that zone of rapid taper. And it can lift sidewalks, pavements, walls, other sorts of infrastructure. As you can see here in the images, trees planted next to infrastructure, it's lifting it, it's cracking it, potential hazards. So roots in nature, they grow mostly straight, unlike, the palms, they're going to branch a little bit. And then areas where they branch, at least on your, hardwoods and stuff like that, these are weak points. They call them hinge points. So this is essentially where the root tends to fail when a force is applied to it. So it's best that, if these root systems do develop with hinge points, that those hinge points are further away from the tree, lowers the likelihood of failure. And that's especially important when these root systems are severely confined. So in the examples here, you got some surface roots, they're branching and growing away from the trunk. And some studies have found that, there's an optimal angle in relation to these surface roots. So you got laterals that are at about 20-degree angles, tend to be the most stable when a force is applied. And smaller and larger angles aren't as strong. So trees and turf roots, they often grow at about the same depth. So this is important to know when you're applying any sort of fertilizer that has a herbicide in it. You can injure the tree as you're trying to manage your weeds in your lawn. And also these roots are competing for resources with the turf grass. So that's, why you'll usually peel back some of the sod when the tree's establishing after you plant it, mulch the area, stuff like that. So there's less competition. So roots, they can graft to roots of like species, maple to the same maple, but sometimes, it won't graft to a different maple, oaks to oaks. But basically the wood connects the two trees together. They're sharing water, nutrients. This is also important to keep in mind as far as any sort of disease issues. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Dutch elm disease, but essentially that's how, a lot of those trees died back in the day, was because they were planted in these, streetscapes where it was just monocultures of elm trees, and the roots had grafted together and the disease passed from tree to tree. And then you lost large portions of the urban forest. So here's just some examples of prominent root flares. So on the left, you have a tropical tree from Singapore. This is, pretty common with that species. And then in the middle, you have, in the right, you have a bald cypress. You got this gradual swelling. And then, different plants are going to have different strategies to support themselves, different looking root flares, but it's about knowing what looks common for that particular species. And when you have a situation where it's just straight up and down like a telephone pole, that's synonymous with some sort of root defect, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So soil type can potentially have a big effect on how roots grow. So if you look at the bald cypress growing in sand, it goes straight down. But when you put that same tree in clay, it's going to stay closer to the surface and kind of branch out more. And typically bald cypress is deep rooted, where, like something like a maple is going to be shallowly rooted. But this can depend all on the soil type and access to those resources. So tap roots and deep roots, they tend to be deflected and aborted by things like clay, water, pH levels can affect it. If you have sandy, rocky soils, salinity, but basically surface, horizontal roots, and sinker roots are all going to develop depending on, some of these soil conditions. So deflections, they can also be the result of things like compacted soil. You'll see them in containers sometimes where they'll hit the wall of the container, start circling and leave an imprint. And then also infrastructure, like we talked earlier, curbs, sidewalks, stuff like that. So trees with root defects are the ones that commonly fail when you see whole tree failures. So when you have like circling roots, bent or kinked roots, those deflected roots, the hinge points, nursery defects that continue to grow after planting, this is where you'll commonly see those failures. So when you have cut roots, it's easier to pull towards the cut than away from it. So typically where you'll see this, in the real world is that when they come in and put a new curbing in along a road, they cut those roots and the trees tend to fail out into the street. They basically have no lateral support on the cut side, and then the tree can go over if a force is applied to it, like a windstorm. So in this example here, you see 4 live oaks that were all planted at the same time. The live oak by the red truck is the smallest of the 4. And we'll take a look at why that's the case here. So the 3 big trees that we saw on each side of the smaller one, they had normal root flares. And then the smaller tree had an abnormal root flare. Essentially, there was a girdling root that was choking out the vascular tissue of that tree and kind of putting it in starvation mode, not allowing it to grow as much as the others. And that was the cause there. So these root issues, they perpetuate in the landscape and can have adverse effects, over a period of time. You might not notice them initially, but over time, it could lead to failure or decline. So here's another defect. You got these deflected roots that developed in the nursery container. Each one of these container shifts, let's say you start with a 1 gallon, go to a 5 gallon, 15. If you don't take care of these defects at the time of shifting it to the next container, they can continue on with every container shift and lead to some issues in the landscape after the fact. So these are known as imprints. It's essentially those deflected roots that take the shape of the container. So if you look at the left here in the example, there's actually 2 imprints. There's one from probably about a 1 gallon container, and then you also have one from about a 5 gallon container. And this prevents those lateral roots from getting out into the landscape while the tree's establishing, and it can make it more susceptible to whole tree failure. And then on the right here, it's an extreme scenario where you had, deflected roots that resulted in a root growing around the trunk of the tree, a girdling root, and it eventually killed the tree because it completely choked off the vascular tissue. So, this poor nursery stock can have real implications in practice here, both financial, public health and safety, potential liability if the tree fails. So on the left here, this is an example of a tree that after it was planted, it started to rapidly decline, and within 2 years, it died, had root issues from the nursery. So now we're going to talk a little bit about anchorage and kind of what affects that. Things from, root depth, how those roots are distributed, number of roots that are going out into the landscape, their diameter, how close they are to the trunk. And in urban areas, these root systems, take on a different form than you'll see, in a natural area or an open grown area. But deep roots tend to be terminated by poor aeration, compacted soils, heavy equipment's run through there, all that stuff. And then roots appear to basically grow primarily from the top of the root ball in these areas. And roots from containers and field grown trees are going to differ. So depending on what, type of plant material you start with, where it came from, it can ultimately be slightly different as far as how it performs in the urban landscape. So if you look at the upper left here, this is, essentially a normal root system. Upper right, this would be a field grown tree. Lower left, this is typically what you would see in a container grown tree. And then in the lower right, you see these straight roots, deep roots. These differ from what we see in the other images, and we're going to take a look to see, how this develops or how we can, kind of control this. and then how this will affect the performance in the landscape. So on the left here, you got nice straight roots that established in the field. And on the right, you can see imprints from about a 3-gallon container, 15, maybe 45-gallon container. And you see most of those larger roots are closer to the trunk of the tree. They were unable to access the surrounding soil, and they basically went down and around at each shift. And this is going to result in instability after planting. So there's some things you can do to, mitigate some of these defects. Root slicing is one possible option, although there's some issues with that. It's better than doing nothing. But basically roots need to be pruned to correct their position and kind of get them to grow out into the landscape. So basically with the slicing, you want to try and prune it at the turns so the roots grow away. Although when there's soil on the root ball, which will be the case, we're not bare rooting, 15-gallon trees. It's difficult to determine where these defects are. So many of them are going to be missed when that soil's on there. And those on the inner part of the root ball are potentially going to be missed because you can't, go all the way in. You're only going in, maybe 4 inches, 6 inches, depending on how big the root ball is. So you end up leaving behind some of these partial circling roots, and then, it can be difficult for them to grow out in the landscape. So another option is shaving. So this removes most of the deflected roots, at least on the size of the container that you're planting it from. If you have imprints from the 2 or 3 preceding containers, it's not going to capture that, which it's hard to capture it with the slicing also. But basically it takes off the exterior of the root ball, and then where the cuts are, all those roots will go out straight. You can use a spade, handsaw, machete, lots of different options. But now we're going to take a look at what this looks like in a nursery setting. So this is my lab manager, Chris. We were planting out some sycamores from 15-gallon containers to 45. So like I said, at each shift, you want to take off a couple inches on the exterior of that root ball. You can see he's cutting through some roots there that had hit the side of the container, began to circle, and that's where that imprint develops from being left in the container either too long, or the roots put on a lot more growth over a short period of time before you got a chance to swapping them out. And like I said, this can be corrected. You're not going to kill the tree doing this. There's been thousands of trees at my lab that have had this done, and only one has died since I started, and that was because the tree had an imprint from a 1-gallon container when it was a 15, and the tree was on its way out when we purchased it anyway.
As you can see on this side more so, those will be measurable, afterwards. But
all right, so you can see all the cuts there to where, those roots were hitting the side of the container, and they would have been defective in the landscape. So now we're going to look at how different production systems can influence root form. So here you see production out in the field from seed. You got these raised beds, about 4 foot wide, 100 foot long. This is one way of doing it. So these are going to be dug at the end of the growing season, either mechanically or by hand. And then they're going to be pruned, and the tap root's going to be cut, and the side roots are going to be trimmed. So this will have a sudden impact compared to, if the tap root was aborted in nature. And then the roots are going to grow out from these cuts. And then they're going to be bundled and stored over winter, and then either planted in a field in the spring or shipped to another nursery to be planted. So they'll be grown in the field for another 1 to 2 years, and then dug as bare roots. You can see, the roots are starting to grow out from those cuts. And then adventitious root flares are going to develop at this point where the tap root was cut. So on the right, you can see different root forms here, depending on how they were handled when they were harvested. So the bottom one, you're going to see more surface rooted laterals. In the middle, you got, some intermediate roots. And then in the top, you have those that are angled down. So the growers, they'll grade the trees and then separate them out by quality based on the root form. Then they're going to be stored sometimes indoors, sometimes outdoors before they're shipped late winter, early spring. Just depends on the operation and the location. Climate plays into it. So then those bare root trees, sometimes they'll spend a year in the container, and then the roots will eventually hit the side and go down before they need to be shifted. And again, you need to address those root defects when you shift. And then some will spend a year in the field, and then the roots, you'll notice there on the bottom right, those will stay straight because they're able to just access that surrounding landscape. So if you plant too deeply, the roots can grow from the root shank, and this is where you can see some root defects like girdling roots, stuff like that. So sometimes you'll see this with bald and burlap trees. So you want to make sure you remove that excess soil from the root flare. No matter what you're planting from, you want to make sure that root flare is exposed. This is going to avoid future defects and potential stability issues. So in situations where the roots are angled down, the root tips are going to be very deep in the soil rather than at the surface like you would see in a more natural setting. So in this case, you might have roots that are starting to grow 12 to 18 inches too deep at planting, and then they're going to grow their way back up because, sometimes there's a lack of oxygen or maybe saturated soils or something like that down below. And then, you have this deep adventitious root flare that you'll see commonly with field propagation sometimes. And if that's not addressed, it leads to those negative situations. So some nurseries, rather than doing it in the field, they'll start with small containers, many different sizes, shapes, technologies. Some have holes in the side to air prune, different materials, stuff like that. You're either going to start with liners or cuttings, and then the deflected roots are typical and need to be addressed at all stages throughout the process. There is no perfect system. Deflected roots, like I said, you just basically need to make sure that you're trimming those away. Here's an example of something you might see. You have ascending roots coming up from the bottom of the container. So they went down, they came back up. On the right, here's that same tree 7 months later. The roots ended up wrapping around the trunk. And if this isn't addressed while the tree's young, it's going to continue to grow and potentially kill the tree or lead to those stability issues. So same situation a few years later, those roots that were at the bottom that came back up, now they're crisscrossing the trunk of the tree, girdling the vascular system, and they need to be removed before planting. These can still, be removed and the tree will perform well. It's not going to hurt it. But if they go unaddressed, 5-7 years down the road, your tree is going to start to decline and eventually die. So another scenario here is the roots can hit the side of the container and grow down, and then all the root tips are at the bottom of the container. So that growth is going to continue as you shift it to a larger container. So when you wash away the soil to kind of take a look what's inside here, the roots stayed at the bottom and there's barely any surface roots. Again, stability issue. So you want to make sure, even with these smaller container trees, that you're shaving off that exterior of the liner prior to the next shift. And it's going to eliminate those defects and future issues. So here's just an example of, liners that were shifted that were either not addressed or they were addressed. So on the left, you can see the imprint here, the new root growth initiated from the bottom because it wasn't addressed. And then on the right, this was root pruned, and it's a nice mix of surface and deep roots for that size of rootstock. So, when trees are not shaved, few of those roots are going to grow out of the larger container. We saw it earlier. The largest roots were in, those imprints for that 1 or 5 gallon container and didn't really get out much to that 15 that we looked at. So when you do shave it, those roots are going to get out into that larger container at every shift. So, no matter what the production method, these defects can result if they're not addressed. They're less common for some species than others, but basically shaving is going to eliminate many of the root defects and help develop those straight root systems. And again, slicing is better than not doing anything, but shaving is probably your best option. You just need to address it throughout the entire process up to planting. And then growers, they're addressing these defects prior to planting, and you want to get those that are near the trunk, those girdling, crossing roots. You want to get either that slice or the shave going to mitigate the defects on the edge. So those circling, diving, ascending, kinked roots. And then, you also want to address those issues where you have excess soil piled up. You want to make sure that those topmost roots are 1 to 2 inches above the soil surface prior to planting. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. So when you're managing tree roots in the landscape, as far as established trees go, a lot of times these can be difficult to treat, especially if it's a major root issue. Smaller root issues you can address, and we'll look at a couple examples. It's better to do this when the tree is younger or even medium aged. Like in this example here, you have an 18 to 20-year-old live oak, canopy dieback due to the girdling roots. The result of poor nursery production, tree was deeply planted. There was also pile of mulch on top, so volcano mulching, which is not advised. So basically, it's going to be harder to address some of these issues as they, grow larger and larger. One study found that as far as root pruning goes, when you're doing any sort of root pruning in a nursery setting, you end up cutting off about 25% of the root system, and you're going to have no negative effect to that tree. The positives definitely outweigh the negatives in these scenarios. So the roots will grow back into the soil beyond the cut here. So smaller roots are going to regenerate better and faster than cutting larger ones. So anything over like 6 inches, it's going to be slow to regenerate roots, but it will happen. So when a root is girdling the trunk, you want to make sure you cut the root before the bend to get the growth directed out and away. So here's some examples of some normal trunk flares. You see that taper the bottom of the trunk out into the root system. And the aesthetic of this will vary depending on the species. Some are more dramatic than others. So the opposite of that would be, that more telephone pole appearance. Trunk goes straight down. You don't see that taper. It's typically the result of deep planting or mulch piled too high. And usually there's a girdling root that's, choking out the tree below the soil. So when you're managing these roots, you want to avoid those situations. So you can see here in the example, 2 trees, maples, they're planted at the same time. The one on the left is bigger than the one on the right. And reason being, so you see the one on the left, it's got that normal root flare. That was the larger tree. The one on the right, there's a circling root that is embedded all the way around that trunk, causing it to decline and not grow as fast as the other. So here's another example of a maple tree. It's declining in the top center, almost dead. And this is usually where you'll see root issues, kind of top center of the tree. It'll start to die back. And in this situation, the roots were growing tangentially to the trunk, and this defect developed and was allowed to grow large underneath the mulch. Didn't even get noticed until the tree started declining, and then it was evaluated. So just in general here, when you're managing roots that hit the side of the container and are descending, over probably the first 5 years, in this situation, those roots were cut, and then you start to develop several lateral roots that were somewhat sizable that were growing out into the surrounding soil. And then this is going to improve the stability. So it doesn't happen overnight. And obviously things can happen to the tree over that course of time. But, if you do have these defects, you want to address them as soon as you notice them. So here's an example of a buried trunk flare. So those adventitious roots are going to grow out from the trunk that's buried under the soil. Potentially they can girdle it, if they start to grow around. And, just by pulling that mulch away, these are easy to snip back and take care of them to where they're not going to have any long-term effects. But basically rule of thumb is you want to keep that mulch about 12 inches away from the trunk of the tree. And then you don't have to worry about these adventitious roots. So that volcano mulching, in this situation, it was removed from this mahogany. The tree was noticed that there was some severe signs of decline. So the mulch was removed, lots of adventitious roots here. Circling roots were below those, and those were developed in the nursery. But those adventitious roots in this case were essentially the only thing keeping the tree green, because the tree was choking itself off, pretty much below that. So this defect prevented the tree from adequate access to water and nutrients. And at this point, it's too far gone. It's not much you can do here. You're probably better off removing the tree, so it's not a safety issue, and planting something else. So on the left here, you have a red maple, roots tangential to the trunk. They were embedded about a year later as the tree continued to put on growth, and the roots continue to grow. So it happens relatively quickly, but it's cutting off the water and nutrients to the canopy. And then on the right here, you got a tulip tree. So you see a 3-inch root growing tangentially across the root flare. Roots won't graft to trunks usually. So, in this situation, it was able to be cut out and removed, and then the tree remained healthy. So in the situation here up top, you had some mulch that was applied up against the trunk of the tree. There was a girdling root that was noticed when it was removed that was deforming the trunk. And in this case, it was easy enough to remove. Again, no grafting. But if you notice where that arrow's at, there's a crack along the raise there due to the girdling over time, and a lack of water. And then essentially the root was able, or the trunk dried out, and it caused this crack in the ray. And then on the bottom here, you have a younger maple. And again, the root was embedded, not grafted. It was removed, and the tree's fine. So again, when they're younger and smaller, it's easier to address this stuff. As far as the ID process for potential problems, you want to excavate that soil without injuring the tree or destabilizing it. In the top right there, you notice where the mulch line used to be. That's way too much mulch. So you want to find the root defects after the mulch has been removed. And then you can, address these issues with a variety of tools, saws, chisels, hammers, pry bars, whatever makes sense. Just try not to damage the trunk. And all this, depends on the severity and the size of the roots you're trying to remove. So now we're going to take a look at the air spading process. So obviously you can't find these root defects if you can't see below the ground. So you want to expose that root collar, try and locate and assess the root issues. And again, it's all about avoiding injuring and destabilizing the tree in the process. It's very messy. But you can see a lot of what's going on with the root architecture once that soil is removed. All right. So when you are removing a defective root, you want to make sure that you cut all the way through. If not, you see in this situation here where the defect continued to grow, and about 2 years later, the root was reconnected. So the defect was, still persisting. When you have situations with ascending roots due to, that volcano mulching, the roots are not growing out into the landscape. Rather, they're kind of growing up into that mulch pile. And, it's a common scenario. I think the worst volcano mulching I've ever seen in my life was in New Jersey. And it was probably at least knee high. Somebody was selling a lot of mulch that season, apparently. But when you have, a lot of soil and a lot of mulch that needs to be removed, this is where those, roots can kind of grow in there. And, once you remove all that soil away, address those defects, don't put more than 1 inch or 2 of mulch back on top. Otherwise, you're going to have the same situation that you just kind of got out of. And then lastly, before we jump to planting here, roots at the surface, you can loosen the soil with the air spade and then kind of stay back away from the trunk here for some of those issues we talked about, destabilizing or injuring. You can add soil, maybe mix some compost, fertilizer, any pH adjustments. A couple inches of soil is fine. You don't want to bury those roots, and then you can put a little bit of mulch on top. It's better than damaging these with a lawnmower or, just kind of having them there to where they can get injured by some sort of mechanical means. So now we're going to kind of look at an overview of the planting process. So obviously we've looked at some different things to consider as far as, selecting species. But the other thing is, improper planting procedures can also have a lasting effect on tree health. And again, as we saw, they're difficult and can be costly to correct later. So aside from, right tree, right place, you want to make sure you use vigorous, healthy nursery stock that is well developed, free of defects. Although, this does not necessarily compensate for those poor site conditions or, poor planning on the front end. And then, aftercare is also critical to the success of the tree, and we'll briefly touch on that as well. So prior to planting, there's several things that need to be considered that are going to help promote tree health and establishment. And in situations, urban areas, there's tons of things at the site that need to be considered outside of the tree itself. But as far as, the size of the tree, the species, specific characteristics, site conditions, these things all need to be considered in planting in urban areas. And, you want to determine what's going to grow well. And in Florida, when you're talking about, timing your planting, we can pretty much plant year round here as long as you're paying attention to irrigation, especially during the hot, dry months until that tree is established. And then in temperate climates, fall and spring are the best times to plant. And basically you can plant as long as the ground isn't frozen. And then aftercare, might vary a little bit depending on timing of your planting. So we're going to look at different types of nursery stock briefly here. So bare root, these are going to be your smaller trees, field grown, typically dug without soil. And those are commonly harvested while they're dormant, stored, shipped, like we saw in some slides a ways back. And then they can be planted late winter, early spring, and do fairly well. Balled and burlap, these are going to be field grown and then spaded. They can be container grown early on, planted in the field and then spaded as well. But it's more important about timing the dig rather than timing the planting, just because you can stress the tree out when you're, potentially removing up to 90% of its root system. And this is more commonly used in colder climates. You'll see B&B up there. But basically, you want to make sure that the root ball is sized accordingly to the trunk diameter. So for, smaller trees, kind of like a 10-to-1 ratio. And as you get to larger trees over 18 inches, about 8-to-1. So, the root ball should be getting larger as the diameter of the trunk's getting larger. And then some studies have found that root pruning can increase root branching, density, and survival over time. And then, like I said, you're essentially losing 90-95% of the root system when these trees are dug. Container grown trees, certain areas, there's a shift from the field to containers, especially in warmer climates. Plastic is typically what is most commonly used, although like if you have a larger tree, something like that, wooden boxes are used periodically. But basically the tree should be sized to the final container that it's in before planting to make sure you got adequately developed root systems. Again, avoid those defects because those are common to these container grown trees. These can be planted pretty much any season. You're going to have minimal root loss other than what you shave off to eliminate those defects. But they might require additional watering due to the substrate that they're grown in. So just keep an eye on the irrigation requirements there. And then when you, get to the site, one of the things you need to consider is adequate drainage. So you want to avoid excess water in the hole. It's going to create, anaerobic-like conditions. So there's some things you can do from drainage tiles to drilling and filling holes. Some people have used gravel in the past, but you got to be careful about standing water at the bottom of the hole. But basically, when you're looking at, how big or how wide that hole needs to be, sites with high quality soil, you only really need to dig as wide as the root ball. Poor quality soil, probably 2 times the width of the root ball, and you're going to be wider at the top than the bottom. It's going to allow for those lateral roots to get out into the soil. And as far as depth, planting too deep is one of the most common mistakes. Like I said, those root flares need to be, those topmost roots need to be about 2 inches above the grade at the end of planting. So on the right here, you see that there was some nursery soil that was removed, but yet it's still too deep. You need that trunk flare exposed, otherwise you're going to see that telephone pole appearance. And like I said, it's somewhere, in that 1 to 2.5 inch range, depending if you're using balled and burlap or containerized trees. As far as soil goes, it's all about that right tree, right place. The tree needs to be adapted to the planting site. For nutrient deficiencies, you can fertilize based off of soil analysis, but they're usually not too effective at planting. And potentially you could lead to scorching the leaves if you did spade a tree out, or if you shaved the root ball just from that exposed cut being hit with that fertilizer. Like I said, it doesn't really do a lot anyway. Once those roots grow out into the landscape, that fertilizer doesn't do anything at that point. And you could add compost to improve organic matter, or maybe biochar for water holding capacity. Maybe address pH issues, but usually pH issues are difficult to address. Then just be cognizant of things like glazing and drying. So glazing is localized compaction due to using a shovel or some sort of digging equipment, and then drying is just the hole being dug in advance. You just want to break this up because it could prevent the roots from penetrating the surrounding soil. So when you're preparing the root ball, you want to remove any synthetic materials. This stuff can be left in place until it's in the hole, but then you want to remove those because they could potentially girdle the roots or the trunk if left in place after planting. And then so these synthetic materials, as we see here, the roots tried to grow through some artificial burlap there on the left, and they eventually became girdled as they grew in diameter. And on the right here, you see a wire basket. The roots actually engulfed the wire basket and continued to grow. The work that's been done on this so far doesn't show any adverse effects to leaving the wire basket on it. Again, it's those synthetic materials that can girdle the roots. So obviously for containerized trees, you're removing that container, you're slicing or shaving the root ball, and that's going to improve that anchorage and allow those roots to grow away from the trunk. In Florida, we have nursery grades and standards. These show, different qualities of nursery stock to kind of give you an idea of, what's high quality versus low quality and shouldn't be planted. And you can access this document online for free. So the PDF, just type in Florida grades and standards, and it's a guiding document there. Unfortunately, it's not mandated, so it's not always used by the growers. And then, once that tree is in the planting hole, you want to stabilize it in a vertical position, lightly tamp that soil around it as you're backfilling it, break up any sort of larger clumps. You can loosen the edge around the hole just to, kind of break that soil up so the roots can go out in there. You'll create a soil ring, and then, you just don't want to add any additional soil over the top of the root ball. Again, those topmost roots need to be above grade a couple inches because it will settle. Mulch is great, can conserve soil moisture, protect against extreme temperatures, weed control, add some organic matter, but you just want to make sure you don't go too deep with it. Otherwise, you can have some of those issues like the girdling roots. It can promote fungi and rodents and stuff to kind of inhabit the area, and then it can affect the tree. As far as pruning at planting, very minimal. You're just removing the dead, broken, weak branches, anything like that. And then over time, you'll structurally prune that tree. Supports, hopefully you don't need any of this stuff, but if you do need staking, guying, bracing, any sort of, things to stabilize the tree, just make sure it's removed within, probably 6 months or a year, worst case scenario. So you don't have a situation like this where the tree got girdled. Same goes with protection. If you need to protect the trunk, it's fine to put these plastic guards and stuff like that on. Just don't leave it on too long. It can create favorable conditions for pests and disease and, ultimately have an adverse effect. Here's just the planting overview. It's evaluating those site conditions, making sure that hole is dug wide and shallow, identifying those root defects and addressing them, making sure those topmost roots are above grade, straighten the tree out, remove those synthetic materials, don't compact the soil as you're putting it back in the hole, lightly apply mulch. And then if you do need to prune or stake or protect the tree, you can do that. Just make sure that, you follow up with it afterwards so those aren't left in place. And then just kind of summarize everything we talked about here. We saw many factors that can affect our urban plantings, from site conditions to, how we design our spaces, the quality of the nursery stock, determine whether or not we follow proper planting procedures can affect the health of the tree and survival. The aftercare that we do, we didn't go too much into that, but that ultimately affects it as well. So, addressing these issues is going to be the first step of many, to promoting these more resilient, sustainable urban tree plantings, to maximize the benefits, minimize the associated risk. And essentially it comes down to selecting that right species for that place to set yourself up for success. So I appreciate your time and be happy to answer any questions you have.
Hey, Ryan, thank you so much. You covered a lot and some really valuable stuff. I love, the showing and demonstrating the tree shaving. I think that's so important, and I don't think we see people do that enough. Do have a couple of questions. You touched on it briefly, but do you recommend compost and biochar in amended backfill?
So to that point, there is a lot of research on the topic that is done on a lot of different soil types, a lot of different amendment amounts, different species, but there's not a lot of repetition of any of those variables. So we really don't know how it affects it. There's been some examples where they see some positive effects for growth and establishment, stuff like that. There's been some that hasn't really shown any positive results at all. There's just so many things across the board that we haven't tested enough. To that point, we're hoping to start a biochar compost study after the first of the year, where we're going to basically follow proper planting BMPs. And we're going to have 4 different treatments. We're going to have our control, which is just planting that tree out with mulch, applying, a couple inches of mulch. We're going to do one where we're amending the soil with biochar, and then the mulch on top. One we're amending the soil with compost mulch on top. And then we're going to do a blend of the compost and biochar, because some of the research has found a synergy between the two, where supposedly in certain cases they found the best of both worlds, both water holding capacity from the biochar and then that additional organic matter from the compost to promote growth and establishment. So hopefully in a couple of years, I will have some results related to a long-term study that, like I said, we're hoping to be starting after the first of the year. I'm not opposed to amending it. I haven't necessarily seen any adverse effects as long as you're following the recommended amounts. But there's just not a lot of research saying that it actually, does help with establishment and growth. There's just a lot we don't know yet. So
I think that, we're going to continue to learn more. And, it's I appreciate the fact that you've got research studies that will address this in the future. So we'll have better recommendations. Many public utilities are demanding root barriers prior to approval of landscape plans. Do you have any recommendations?
So again, I got a study. We're starting. We were fortunate enough to get a donation from Deep Root root barrier manufacturer for a plant spacing study. So we're going to be planting in little islands, long planting strips, and open grown to look at stability, health, and establishment issues. But the one thing I will say is I don't have anything against using root barriers. I mean, if anything, it's going to protect your infrastructure. I think I heard at one point that like a typical sidewalk in an urban area, you only get about 20 years out of anyway. But it's going to protect that sidewalk for a little bit, protect the curbing. Odds are the roots aren't going to, do too well underneath that infrastructure anyway. Ultimately, it comes down to putting the right tree in that space. So, something that you only have a 4-foot wide planting strip, you're not wanting to plant a live oak in there, like we saw from Dr. Kozer's findings as far as the Tampa street tree plantings and, the amount of space. So again, it comes to matching that species to the site. But root barriers are great just for protecting that infrastructure and kind of directing those roots. Like I said, it's essentially when you have those small planting spaces, it's like you're planting in a large container. So just, right tree, right place is going to be the best means for success.
Great. What do you think of root washing?
Root washing in what regard?
I don't have any more context.
Yeah, I mean, we do it like if we want to identify root defects, if we, plant something in a container or spade it out, we'll wash the roots off to measure and quantify the defects. As far as washing, I mean, you have your bare root trees when they're small. I mean, anytime you remove the soil away from the root system, it's going to affect stability. So I wouldn't recommend it. Larger the tree, the harder it's going to be on that tree. I mean, I've seen some okay sized, like maybe 1.5 inch caliper bare root stuff periodically, but even at that point, I question how well it's going to do. So and maybe I'm not understanding the context of the question, but that'd be kind of my general recommendation.
Yeah, my guess is they were just thinking of washing the soil off the roots at planting, perhaps a young tree so that they could maybe inspect the roots.
Yeah, and so it's not bad to kind of dig around a little bit. So when you're removing that excess soil anyway, you're trying to find that trunk flare, those topmost roots. I've seen 15-gallon containers where you end up taking off 6-8 inches, and you're still, not finding those topmost roots. So the best thing you can do is just to ensure there's no issues at planting. Know your growers, know that they're, following some, mitigation or, following the grades and standards as far as developing sound root systems. But then also when you go pick this tree up, don't be afraid to remove that soil from the base of the trunk of the tree to find those roots. If you're digging down and, it's 2-3 inches, don't buy that tree. So, I mean, just make sure that you get the tree to your house and it's a high quality tree before you even leave that nursery. And then that alleviates a lot of these issues. And like I said, shaving the root ball goes a long way. We only lost one tree recently, and that was because the tree was such poor quality that tree wasn't going to make it another 6 months anyway. It was so root bound. So yeah, it's just about, getting those quality trees. And in that situation, we were wanting to test some bad trees. So it made sense for the study. But yeah, as from a homeowner perspective or municipal perspective, just know your growers and make sure you're leaving with quality trees. And, I don't know if there's any developers on the call, stuff like that. If you get trees that there are, major defects related to roots that you're able to identify or structural issues on the above ground portion of the tree, reject those trees. I mean, that's what the grades and standards are there for. It kind of gives you an idea of what's going to do well in the landscape moving forward and what's not. And, those major defects, if they're allowed to grow large, that's when you have these, big failures. And that's when you're just basically throwing your money away and pumping more money into it to try and, mitigate some of them after the fact.
All right. When straightening leaning trees less than 4 inches, is root pruning recommended?
Well, so sometimes you'll have trees that lean after a hurricane due to some of these circling roots. So those imprints we talked about earlier, basically it just doesn't allow the roots to get out into the landscape. If you think you can, maybe slice around the root ball because you think there is a circling root or something like that, it wouldn't hurt it. But you'd go to stand that tree back up. And if those roots are unable to get back in the surrounding landscape after you've corrected the lean, it's probably going to fail again. Roots or trees that fail once, are commonly fail again and again. So it's probably, a result of poor quality nursery stock. If it was the result of maybe construction nearby, let's say they were replacing some curbing and that tree leaned a little bit, you probably, have to have that stake on there for multiple seasons, adjusting it periodically to make sure it doesn't girdle it until enough of those roots can get back out there, especially given it being, potentially a smaller planting space.
All right. What do you kind of expect to see in the wake of Hurricane Ian?
So most of what I saw on the news was those small planting spaces, the whole tree failures, and then massive bark inclusion. So you'll have codominant stems where instead of having apical dominance and you got a single leader going up the center of that tree, you'll have multiple leaders. And then typically they'll basically grow against each other rather than connective tissue in between them. And then you'll see those separate in the storm, and that's where these failures will occur. As far as specific stuff, I think so. We had done a study back in 2018, 19, something like that, after Hurricane Irma, where we were fortunate to get a data set from Naples, Florida, to look at the damage and mitigation that occurred with their trees. It sounds like we're going to get that data set again once they've collected it here soon to kind of assess their tree canopy again. So we should know some more. A lot of it came down to species related variables, and other studies have found, if there's pre-existing defects, those are the trees that are typically going to fail. If there's those bark inclusions, or, site conditions aren't super conducive to tree growth for that size of tree. And then some species variables, some are more weaker wooded than others. Obviously, we see our laurel oaks kind of blowing apart sometimes, and your live oaks are going to be more resilient. And, there's other examples of that. But yeah, so I'm assuming we're going to see some similar stuff. The other thing that plays into it, wind speeds. So obviously the stronger the wind speed, even that, live oak, that's kind of like a Sherman tank. You got a category 3 to a category 5, all bets are off for that. And then the thing we don't consider as much with whole tree failures is, how much rain did you get? If you have super saturated soils, those roots will slip in the soil, and then you'll see the tree go over. And it's especially important in those small planting spaces. So it's not just the force of the wind, but it's the combination of the wind and those saturated soils. But so I'm assuming we're going to see pretty much a lot of the same. We just haven't seen a lot of species repeated in data sets over different wind speeds and different amounts of precipitation. So it's just going to keep building on that, and then we'll fine tune our understanding as time goes on, and hopefully make more meaningful recommendations.
Ryan, I know you're not a palm expert, but this person has a 16-foot queen palm that's now leaning because of the hurricane. Can it be straightened?
16 foot's a pretty big, so it'd be pretty top heavy. It's possible. Don't quote me on it. I mean, and the only reason I'm saying this is because sometimes you'll see large palms that are planted in a new development, and they're, spading out, let's say maybe like a 36-inch, 40-inch root ball, and then they're bracing it with essentially 2x4s and then padding around the trunk to keep from damaging it. And there really isn't a lot holding it up other than those, supports and that small root ball and whatever weights associated with it. It could be done. I would maybe, if you're wanting to reach out to somebody who's a palm expert, Micah McMillan would be a better person to vet that question to, and or, contacting an arborist that deals with palms specifically. It's possible, just based off of, how I would picture, spading these things out and planting them into the landscape. It's possible. No guarantees though.
Yeah.
The other thing is keeping the
touch
tree healthy and stuff like that is going to go a long way, if you are able to prop it back up.
And she can touch base with her local extension agent, can help put her in touch with Micah. So great, excellent feedback. How long after planting before applying fertilizer, or would amended soils do the job?
So I would amend the soils before I would do fertilizer. Like if you're talking at planting, the issue is, so if you do have to correct any defects like circling roots, from a containerized tree, or if the tree was recently spaded out and if it didn't harden off long enough, if you apply fertilizer, slow release, you're usually okay, but sometimes you can still get some scorching in the leaves due to the uptake from that fertilizer on those cut roots. So, I mean, if you are adamant about fertilizing at planting, definitely use slow release. But honestly, I wouldn't fertilize at least for the first year, or at least till that tree's established. So depending where you're at in the state, about 4 months, South Florida, North Florida, up to 6 months. And then you're probably fine. But yeah, you're better off just, amending it with, some compost or something like that. But then keep in mind, once those roots grow out of that planting hole, those amendments don't really do anything. So that's why I said it's all about, planting a species that is, going to be conducive to those planting conditions, and it'll perform better that way, rather than trying to nurse something along that maybe isn't a good fit for that space.
Okay. This person is wanting to put a live oak in a 12-foot planting space. Will a root barrier help in this case, or does it need structural soils?
So if it's a 12-foot by 12-foot planting space, so like 144, like you'd probably be fine. The recommendations are slightly more than that, but I'll be honest with you, trees are very resilient, and we see them planted in a lot smaller spaces than that all the time, and they do fine. I would recommend the root barrier just for the sake of protecting the surrounding infrastructure. But yeah, if you do have it in a budget to do, structural soils or silvicelles or channeling roots to where it'll just allow additional growth beyond that 12 by 12 area, you're going to be better off. But like I said, we do see situations with a lot smaller planting spaces than that, and those trees do well. Obviously, when we talked earlier about having, a 16-foot wide planting space for a 69-inch live oak, that's ideal. But most of our urban tree plantings are in less than ideal situations, just the nature of, how these cities and stuff are designed, and how infrastructure's placed in the city and stuff like that. So you'd probably be fine.
So if a small tree is sprouting from the root flare, should it be culled?
So like you're saying in the nursery setting, or?
I don't have any more context.
Yeah, and as far as that goes, like you can still have, if you're talking like sprouts that are putting out leaves and branches, if allowed to grow large over time, you can just snip those back. If you're talking sprouting from the trunk, as far as adventitious roots, you also want to snip those back, because those are the ones that could potentially girdle the trunk. So either way, you're fine to snip them back, but I wouldn't say that just because you have either of those, it's necessarily a cull. You need to factor in, how's the rest of the root system? Are you able to find that trunk flare, those topmost roots? How's the crown look? Is there a dominant leader, or do you have 5 or 6 leaders and tons of bark inclusions and crossing branches and stuff like that? So there's more that goes into it than that. And like I said, those, a lot of times, they might have those at the nursery before they ship them out, and they're just snipping them anyway. So that's definitely not like a downgrade, in my opinion.
All right. How do we control oak sprouts?
So like volunteers,
I think, just coming from the roots.
Yeah.
Trees.
I mean, I know you can do light applications of some herbicide. If you got that, you can mow over top them. If it's in a mulched area, you can snip them back by hand. I typically try to avoid any sort of herbicides, because, systemically it could take it up to the root system. Although on smaller sprouts like that, I haven't necessarily witnessed any adverse effects from people doing that. It's more just kind of a nuisance thing where you're going to constantly be fighting it. I don't know that there's necessarily a way to prevent the tree from doing it.
It almost seems like the more it's disturbed, the more it puts up suckers.
Yeah, and like I said, by rights you can hit them with the lawnmower. It's not going to hurt the tree.
Can you describe root barriers? Give just a little description on what you're referring to.
So there's 2 different kinds that are on the market right now that I'm aware of. There's one that's a roll. So it'll be, I can't remember exactly the millimeter, but it'll be some millimeter of plastic that you just basically roll out, and you'll put it at the edge of the planting hole up against your infrastructure. And then the roots will hit that and deflect. Otherwise, the ones that we're going to be using for our study are a little bit more heavy duty than that. And especially if you have an aggressive tree where the roots can either go over top of something, go under it, potentially poke through it as plastics break down over time. There's thicker panels that lock together that they're anywhere from 2 to 4 foot tall, and I think they're 36 inches wide, but you just lock them together throughout the whole duration that you're trying to barrier off from the roots.
Okay, awesome. 2 more questions and then we'll let you go.
Not a problem.
Any good big shaped trees with less aggressive roots than live oak? There's a 7-foot wide planting area for street trees, and they're looking to create shade for the community, but have that limited planting space. And I don't know what part of the state. So,
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That part of the issue there is where it's going to be at. I will say there's a couple good resources out there related to trees for the state. There's Trees North Central Florida and Trees South Florida that Dr. Kozer came out with. It's pretty much like the 120-ish most common trees for those areas, but kind of gives you an idea of growth habits, stuff like that. Not knowing the exact area and not seeing the site condition, it's kind of hard, but a lot of it comes out to, once you determine a couple species that work, preferences. Everybody, likes different trees, stuff like that. But yeah, there's plenty of resources out there. The other thing you can look up, and I'll do a shameless plug here in a second. So there's the EDIS fact sheets, but there used to be something called the Florida Tree Selector. It went offline at the first of the year. I was able to get a grant from the Florida chapter of the ISA to redo the website with a collaborator of mine, Dr. Howard Beck. And springtime, we should have that back online.
Fantastic.
These articles will be all updated, and it's basically you can sit there on your computer, put in all your site conditions, and it'll kick back all the species that would fit in that area, and then it pulls up all the fact sheets. You can look at some of those other variables like fruit, flower, the size, all that stuff. That's
exciting. That's awesome, Ryan. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'll ask the last question, kind of a little more philosophical question. How can we change the landscape architects' minds on speccing large trees and small islands?
So unfortunately, a lot of LA programs do not require that the student takes arboriculture or urban forestry. They might have like a plant ID class, and even some of those, I think even at UF, that's not required anymore, if I'm correct. I had some students in my arboriculture class in the spring that I believe they said that was dropped from the required courses, or maybe it's an elective now. But the point of the matter is, I think there needs to be more of a focus in LA programs at the university level or any sort of certificate level that focuses on urban forestry and arboriculture, because a lot of the kind of landscape design fails are the result of not understanding how to manage trees appropriately in an urban setting. Selecting that high quality nursery stock, free of defects, and then that right tree, right place dynamic. That's how we get a lot of these situations where, that tree shouldn't have been planted there in the first place. And then the other part of this is local codes and ordinances. There's a lot of codes on the books, but unfortunately, they're not always enforced because, municipalities are understaffed, underfunded, and, they're chasing their tail. And when development is running rampant throughout the state, sometimes some of these situations fall through the cracks. So it's a combination of factors there, but I think it comes down to education or a lack thereof in regards to, managing trees in the urban landscape.
Yeah. And, it's, as you say, there's a lot of it that has to do with ordinances and a lot of reasons why various trees are spec'd the way they are. So but it all comes down to education and, getting the information out to folks. So what you did today is so valuable, so important. I saw one of the comments come through, best tree presentation they've ever seen. It came across over and over again. They loved the planting specs that you were doing in the video that you showed. So thank you so much for being willing and taking the time to do this. Just to let everybody know, remind you that if you can complete your survey, that does help us, give good information for planning for next year. And remind you about November 8th is our next one. It's mangroves coming to a neighborhood near you with Alyssa Vincent. Everybody, thank you so much. Ryan, thank you again one more time, and have a great day, and we'll see you guys on November 8th.
You as well. Thanks, Tom. See you, Claire, Melissa. Appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you so much.